Welcome back to Amplified. Conversations about race are multidimensional, complex, and can be uncomfortable, even among decades-old friends. I recently caught up with historian of race and racism, Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He talked about how he and his best friend of 35 years, Ben Austin, navigate the topic on their podcast, Some of My Best Friends Are. Take a look. Khalil, you have an awesome podcast out now with one of your dearest friends, Ben, and it's called Some of My Best Friends Are. Tell us about the context of the podcast and the origins of it.
Yeah, so Ben Austin is an award-winning journalist. He's also my best friend. We've known each other for 35 years. We met on the south side of Chicago, went to high school together, worked together at a computer store selling first-generation PCs. We bagged groceries together at a local grocery store. We also played tennis together as best friends. He's always been a little bit better than me. But in the midst of the Trump era, we started thinking about the conversations we've been having as best friends over these past 35 years. And because I happen to be a historian of race and racism, and he happens to be a journalist who covers race and racism in his writing, he's written about public housing in a book called High Risers, we thought we'd want to share these conversations with a bigger audience. And we wanted to kind of flip the premise of the show on its head by saying, how many people really think that they aren't racist because they know someone of a different race and say, hey, I grew up with this person who's black, I can't be a racist. We wanted to point out, that's not good enough. Proximity doesn't solve for systemic racism. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek and ironic to use the relationship as a way to invite people into the conversation, but really to open up onto this huge palette where we talk about a lot of different difficult and important things.
And you really get into the nitty-gritty on race. So give the folks a preview of a couple of the heated issues that you two get into.
Yeah, so we have an episode where we both visit European prisons. I go to Germany, he goes to the Netherlands. And in this podcast, we reflect on how different punishment is in those places, how much human dignity rests at the center of how Europeans treat people, even when they've killed people, that the average sentence, even for murder, runs anywhere from 2.5 to 4 years. And there is a really intense commitment to individualized therapeutic intervention to really find out what happened in this person's life that led them to take another person's life. That's, of course, at the extreme end of punishment. But basically, 95% of their sentences are concluded before 4 years. I also talk specifically about an experience coming home where I'm essentially criminalized by the TSA, coming back from a trip, looking at how Germans engage their own incarcerated populations. It's a really powerful episode. We also have fun. We talk about these two classic interracial buddy films, 48 Hours and Lethal Weapon, and we dive deep into the racial politics of each film, pointing out to our viewers that Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte in 1982 48 Hours have this incredible commentary about racism and this incredible scene that looks at policing from the inside out. I'm telling you, if you haven't seen it in the past 30 years, you have to listen to our podcast and go back and watch 48 Hours.
Oh, totally doing that. Now I got to go back and I got to listen and watch, of course, the movie so that I can then tweet you to talk about it. So
That's
having
right.
this best friend for 35 years that you have so much in common with, but then, so many differences, I wonder, how do you two today still navigate race? Because you think about it systemically and structurally, but you're still pals, right? And have your own culture. So do you ever get off track with each other? And how do you come back together when you do?
Yeah, we have been friends for so long, it kind of transcends the kind of buddy relationships that people have for a season. For example, what happens when you get your first job and maybe you meet a white woman as your colleague for the first time and you guys kind of hit it off and you get to know each other, and part of getting to know each other is realizing that you've had a whole different set of experiences growing up, and at some point there's that awkward moment when she says something that surprises you and you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to work with her on this. Or in my case, I remember when Obama was running for president, I was teaching at Indiana University, a very white school in a very white place. And one of my white colleagues came up to me and said, hey, what do you think about this Jeremiah Wright guy? And I and I was like, oh, snap. Like, this is that moment when someone is basically testing me to see, you know, what kind of black are you? And I said, well, it turns out I'm from Chicago. I used to go to that church. I know Jeremiah Wright very well. And what's happening to him is not fair. You know, politics of winning the election, you know, was not my primary concern. It's about saving Jeremiah Wright's reputation. Ben and I, fortunately, have mostly been simpatico around these issues, right? You know, we come from the same community. We went to the same high school. He married his high school sweetheart, who happens to be a black woman. And so part of it is that we do think a lot about these issues. But I will say, listening to the whole season of the podcast, recording it, I've learned a little bit more about him than I had expected, even going into it, which is one of the good things that comes out of this kind of shared experience. And, you know, he's got a little more white on his side of the equation than I remember growing up.
You know, thank you for sharing that. And what's so just endearing about your podcast is that it really is about relationship at its core and a friendship. And when you have those relationships over time, like you've described, and, you know, too, my best friend happens to be white, which is like the last thing that we think about because we have been sisters for decades at this point, that there's so much of a connection. We don't think about it in that way. Also because we share the same values and we share the same politics and we share some of the same kind of experiences in our own socialization as young people, which brings us together. But I love the example that you just brought up about like starting a job and connecting with a colleague, and then you're like, oh, we actually have very different experiences. I have found that white folks tend to want to be really colorblind, right, in their approach because they're nice white people, and you know you have fun at happy hour together. Talk to us about the perils of that, of the relationship building that is colorblind.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point about colorblind, the sort of colorblind ethos that's so dominated our social and cultural community in the United States, and certainly our politics. This is precisely the problem. Because essentially when you define a relationship by saying I'm colorblind, you're also saying I don't really see your full humanity. And the humanity that I do see in you is really more like me, because I don't even see my own race. I don't see my own privilege. I don't see the ways in which whiteness actually helps me navigate the world differently than you. So it is a complete denial and erasure of the actual problem of the elevated danger that people of color face simply living in their skin. And this is, of course, something Ben knows and understands, but it takes relationship and it takes friendship. And I think that's why it's so important for our show to do this. This is so important for what you're doing on this segment of your show, because what you want to invite white people into is to say, if you're fully invested in a friendship, then you're fully invested in the world that I live in, that you're going to share with me. And that means taking on the risk, doing the work, and helping to change the society.
Yeah. You know, we started off the show talking about microaggressions and then, of course, the macroaggressions, especially from the colorblind types of white folks who completely miss the mark. And I wonder, you know, what would you offer as any advice, if you can, to folks like us who are friends with white people, and then for white people who are wanting to have more diverse relationships in their lives, about how you can come together without the guilt and the ickiness of the broader society to just be authentic in relationship?
Yeah, so I think people have to lean into the fullness of what their friend is actually experiencing. I mean, this would be like a father saying to a daughter, I love you, but all that stuff that you're experiencing as a girl about being mistreated or being subject to discrimination or being made fun of or told that girls can't do it, like, you know, that stuff makes me uncomfortable and I don't really want to talk about it. That's absurd, right? and just to emphasize this point, I remember about 15 years ago when I was just starting out at Indiana University, my family befriended another white family. Our kids went to the same preschool together. And after a few weeks of getting to know each other, we were at a dinner party at their home. And the mother of in the relationship, she said to me, she said, "Is all you ever talk about is race?" And it was like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, hey, that's what I do for a living. Like, it's not just that I'm Black. This is actually, these are the things that I work on. And you should care about them too, because you shouldn't want to live in a racist society. So the cautionary note there and the advice to your viewers is that if you're going to show up in a relationship, claim someone as a friend, then you have to be in it for everything. And in that act is also the baby step towards helping to change the society.
Wow. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, the co-host of the awesome podcast, Some of My Best Friends Are. Thank you so much for talking to us about race, and to personalize it, you know, through your podcast is really a great lesson, and also entertaining, by the way, for us all. So thank you for being here on Amplified. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Aisha. It's really great to be on the show.